do you draft a pattern for a cowl neckline? That's what we're going to be talking about today for Tricky Thursday. Most of the time, I like to do flat pattern where we're dealing with our patterns flat on the table. We manipulate some things around, but for this kind of design, I actually like to do more draping. So let's dive in to what that looks like, how to make a cowl neck pattern. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Trisha. I'm your pattern nerd friend. I love talking all things pattern making. Usually we come at it from a fitting perspective or a flat pattern perspective. But for this particular design, the cowl neck, actually I say cowl neck, but really it could be a cowl anywhere. A low back cowl, a cowl on the sleeve, a cowl on the side, all the same principle. You can do it by flat pattern, but for something like this is where I like to go into draping. And I know a lot of you are curious about draping if you aren't involved already. It is a lot easier to see what is happening with your fabric when you can put it on the form. For this particular design, I think to figure out how much fullness you really want to have in a certain area, how much drape that you want, it depends on the fabric you're gonna be using. A lot of that's just easier to see on form. How do you start? Where do you start? And that's what we're going to dive into today. So if you like this kind of thing, you like learning about pattern making, you like learning about fitting and sewing tips from your girl Trish, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, build my channel, and help me to create more videos like this. Turn on those notifications so that you never miss when a video drops. Let's get into this. So the first thing with drafting or draping a cowl design is that it really should be on a bias. So you need to do, or the best thing to do when you are going to be drafting or draping a cowl like this is to draw in your bias grain line. Actually, I didn't do that yet because I wanted us to do it together. So, but that really helps the fall of the drape of the cowl happen a little bit more naturally. If you're doing it on the straight of grain, you're fighting with it the whole time. If you're gonna do a cowl design, you should have the bias grain line being your center. So we're gonna set that up. The other thing to mention about doing a cowl design is there always is a facing, because notice I'm not going to see just the raw edge. If this is the raw edge of the fabric, it's not going to drape nicely. How are you gonna finish that off? So there's usually a self-facing. Now this is just the edge of the fabric. When we get into how you're doing this, you're gonna see, but there always is kind of a facing that fits to the inside so that when it's worn, you're not gonna see that raw edge and it finishes itself off that way. But it's kind of a different way of doing facings if you're familiar with doing facings in other adaptations on bodices. So let's start at the beginning. I'm gonna go over to the table and show you how we set up the fabric to start this drape, and then we'll come back to Miss Susie and do a little draping. Now, with your fabric that you're gonna be using to drape your cowl, you wanna make sure to mark the bias grain of your fabric. Now, we have the traditional straight of grain, which would be parallel to your selvage, like so. And then we have the cross grain, which goes 90 degree to that selvage or typical grain line. And then the bias is exactly 45 degrees to the grain line. So there's a couple of different ways that you can figure out where the bias is on your fabric. One way is you could fold your fabric like so if you have a selvage, and make sure that your selvage is now 90 degrees to your other selvage at the fold. And so that will tell you that this fold line is your 45 degree or your bias grain line. So you could take this and mark your fold line. That's probably the simplest way. It's not the most accurate way to get your bias, but it is a way that I've seen done so you can actually see that fold, and that's gonna be pretty darn close to your true bias grain. The other way to look at it and maybe be a little bit more accurate is to still use that selvage there. And if you have a 2-inch wide ruler like this, see-through ruler, if you take a 4 square chunk, so if you have 4 squares, right? So we have 2 inches going one way, 2 inches going the other way. If we can get the selvage to be diagonal from this point to this point on our 4 square, that will also tell us, and any 4 squares, you know, it doesn't have to be. So you can see here, that's my 4 square area. And then I've got the selvage touching from this point to this point. So that's telling me the edge of the ruler is going to be my bias grain. So that is another way that you can mark your bias. So I'm gonna come over here to the edge of my fabric so that I can get the most fabric to work with when I'm doing this. So I can mark my bias, lining over here. Again, I've got that 4 square and I've got the selvage going from here to here. So that is telling me that this is my bias grain, and I'm just gonna draw that in with a marker, with a chalk. Obviously, if it's your real fabric, you don't wanna use a marker. And then once I've got it going, I can just continue with this ruler, drawing it straight. And you can even see, if you guys can still see that fold line, see how it's parallel with that fold line. So either way, whatever makes the most sense to you is what we need. So that is how we set up our fabric to get ready to do a cowl drape. Okay, now we've got our fabric with our bias grain line drawn on for us, and you can see just like so. And depending on what you're wanting to drape, what kind of cowl, you know, if you're just doing a top, you probably don't need as much fabric. Of course, this is for Susie. This would probably be enough for a top for me. But if you were wanting to drape a full dress, you want to make sure you have the length that you're going to need to do a full dress. So be mindful of that. And to be honest, this muslin is really stiff. It's not probably the best fabric to use for a nice cowl drape, but it will show you the folds a little bit easier for this video, so it might work out to be better. Now, the first thing you want to do is you want to flip. Remember that facing I was telling you about? So just flip a little bit down. You don't need a lot, and actually what you can do after you've finished your pattern is you can kind of round this facing and make it look a bit nicer. You don't have to keep that point like that, but we do need a folded edge to start. And how far down really depends on how deep you want your first fold. So the reason that we we draw on our bias grain line is because that's going to help us as we drape this onto the form. So we want that bias grain line to be as close to center while we're doing this as possible. And that will make sure that the center of this is on the true bias grain line. And that's gonna make the folds fall nicely. So depending how deep you want this first fold to be, so I have it folded just a little bit so we can start our cowl a little bit higher. And you can see you wanna kind of play with the fabric to make it do what you want it to do. Now, if I wanted a deeper fold, then I'm gonna need to fold this down a bit more so that I have a longer folded edge, and then I can have a deeper fold. But again, having that visual of where that bias grain line is, notice how now it can be a lot deeper. So that's what determines how far down you fold that facing. So I'm gonna pull her up somewhere in the middle of what we just did. And then you wanna have pins ready, any kind of pins. And of course, this is a design that's gonna be a lot easier to do on a dress form or something that you can pin into, obviously, and maybe do a mock-up, like stitch it in place and then try it on the body, just because you're gonna wanna be able to pin into things. So I'm gonna start somewhere in this area to set my first cowl. And again, I'm being mindful of where this grain line is. I want it to be as center as possible. And then you pin that in place. And then you can kind of play. This is the great thing about draping, right? Is that you can kind of play and see what you want to have happen. And having that extra fabric, remember we folded that down to get that facing. So having that extra fabric in there can kind of get in the way. You want to kind of ignore that as much as possible and just pay attention to what this outer fabric is doing. But you can kind of start to like see how it'll lay. And like I said, this muslin is not the drapiest, nicest fabric. But once you've got that first fold kind of started, then you can look into, and usually most cowl designs will have pleating going up to form the cowl, and that will give you more folds in your cowl. So I'm gonna pleat on one side, and you can either pleat so that it's pleat, 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 like next to each other, or you can pleat on top of the pleat that you've already set in place. It's really up to you as the designer, what you are trying to achieve. And of course, notice how now this grain line is being pulled towards this side because I've pleated that side up already. So as I am pleating this side, see how it straightens out. So that's what I'm kind of doing, keeping that mindful, and why it's good to have that here. So I'm keeping that bias grain center as I'm doing this, and I can kind of start to visualize what I want this cowl to be. Like I said, you can do this at the back, you know, a fancy back dress, or on a sleeve, really anywhere, but this is the same kind of principle that you're thinking of. And then let's just put one more. I usually like to work in odd numbers, so I'll put one more pleat there, one more fold. And the nature of a cowl design is these folds are gonna do what they wanna do. Having it on the bias grain, notice how we've got it angled again, so I've only done the one side, they will kind of fall where they're gonna fall. Like you can kind of train it, but that's the kind of organic nature of this design. You can only control it so much. You control it up here in the shoulders or wherever your anchor point is for the top of the cowl. And then this kind of middle part does what it wants to do. And by having it on the bias, you usually are able to achieve a nicer fall, if you will. If it's trying to right the grain all the time, if you did this on the straighter grain, it's just not gonna, the folds won't be as nice. They won't kind of fall as easily as they do when they're on a bias. After you've decided, okay, I like that amount of fullness that's there, say you want to make this into a dress, then what I next do is keep that center line, right? This is your grain. So we don't want to pull, you know, notice if I start pulling this, you know, if I pull this to the side, notice what's happening with the cowl. So you want to keep that, and when you're draping, I know I've not done a lot of draping videos because it's not something I do all the time, but you want to keep that grain. It's all about keeping that grain where you want it to be. Now she's kind of turned away from me, so I'm making sure that I have her on the center. So I kind of pin that grain line down to the form first, because I want to make sure that that is going to stay in place while I am smoothing the rest of this out. So that's staying there. Now I can kind of start to smooth out from the center where I want it to be fitted. Say I want it to be kind of more fitted in through the skirt. So you're gonna wanna start cutting in so that you can work with this fabric a bit more. And now we're getting into some draping principles that I haven't gone over here, but this should help you get started. So I'm cutting into where I want it to sit at the waist, and see how it's really wanting to pull in that area, which is why I pinned that down. But I'm getting kind of close to the waist here. Notice how I'm able to do that because I clipped in. I'm still not able to because it's connected. It's trying to fight with that other part. But notice now how the rest of the skirt can kind of fall where I want it to, and I can do a flared skirt, or I can continue with a bodycon skirt as I clip into that to get the pattern that I'm looking for. And so you're kind of pinning, oh, and you can see, I didn't see how I'm already off because I didn't pin that straight where I should have. So it's really important to set that grain at the front first. And then you can even continue as you're going up here. See how it's connected still? But as I am kind of smoothing this up, if I clip in here so that the fabric can hug more to the body, you know, I can kind of smooth that out a little bit as I'm going into the side seam. And that's really what draping is you are moving the fabric around on the body, on the form, and placing it where you want it to go. It's catching up here too because of the shoulder. So as I cut more of that away, I can now kind of smooth this up into the side seam where I want it, and I'm kind of controlling this cowl. So I'm letting it do what it wants in the center, but I am making it fitted to where I want it to be fitted here in the side seam. So you can kind of see this side we're smoothing out, and you would do the same on the other side. I'm gonna do that same thing that I was just showing you, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. So as you can see, we've got more of a like fitted skirt. I did unpin the front so you can kind of see what it's doing. There is some extra fullness under here. It is biased, so it will hug the body a little bit differently, especially if it's a different fabric. But because we have this fullness coming down so far when we did the original cowl, you're only gonna be able to get it so fitted in that area as it transitions into the more fitted skirt. But it gives it a really nice way that it looks. And see, I am kind of folding and controlling these a little bit, but they're gonna kind of fall how they want to. And you can play around with these, you know, these cowl drapes if you want them to be, you know, more stacked on top of each other. That will give a softer cowl. Notice how everything's kind of right now the way I had it, where it all went up to one point, that it's all kind of swooping up to one point. That's a great thing with draping, is you kind of make a decision and you can see what it's gonna do on the body. If I pulled this up a bit more, you can see how that's gonna change it a little bit. So fine tune that, but it's easier to start with the cowl first and then go into where you want the rest of the garment to go, the fitting of it would go. Now, here's the important part. In order to translate this to a paper pattern, you need to take this off the form, but before that, you need to mark it. Don't make the mistake that I did the first time I learned about how to drape a cowl, and have your teacher help you and then take it off the form and be like, okay, how do I do that again? She was not happy. So you wanna make sure that you are marking where your shoulder line is, these folds, like how do these folds, because these are gonna end up being pleats that you're gonna need to know how to do that again when you get it in the real fabric, where you want your seams to be and all of that. So I'm gonna do that and then I'll show you as well. Okay, and I wanna show you everywhere I did mark. So I marked where the side seam is, where I want that armhole to go, and on both sides. And then more importantly, I marked these pleats. Notice how I marked where they're pleated. So I marked the shoulder, where I want the shoulder seam to be, because you're gonna attach this to a back, presumably. And I marked where my pleats are. So the fold of the pleat, where it hits the underside of the pleat. And then I gave myself like a little notch. Not that we're gonna sew those closed, which you could do, but it also shows me the angle of the pleat and how that's gonna go in. And same thing here, you can see I did the fold and the angle. And then I also like to mark all the way along that first fold there so that I know how I can cut off the facing on the inside. Now let's take this off and look at what it looks like flat. So here's what that looks like flat. Pretty crazy looking, right? And look, this is our folded edge that started our first cowl. Look how crazy that is, that it's basically 90 degrees to our grain line. So, and here are our pleats. So if I pleat that up like this, you can start to see that shape come back together, like so. See how we're starting to see that cowl form again. So that's what's really gonna help you when you transfer this to paper, know how those go back together again. And then this would get folded in to create your drape. And like I was mentioning at the beginning of the video, you don't wanna have all of this fabric. We need to have that in there for when we are doing the initial drape, but you can definitely, you know, round this out, make this a much smaller facing. And then when you start to fold all of this back again, you're not gonna have all of that extra fabric that you don't want in there, but we're still creating our drape, and we know where our armhole is, we know where our skirt and everything is fitted. And you do wanna keep it on the bias grain. So pretty crazy, cool, right? So there you have it. I mean, of course, with different fabric, if you want a slightly different design, if you wanna do a cowl in a different position, of course things will be slightly tweaked, but really you can kind of play with it. And that's what I do love about creating the cowl draft in this way because you can really see what it looks like. It looks kind of funny when you get it down flat, right? And I would advise, do this to get your initial pattern, but always do a mock-up again in something closer to the real fabric or the real fabric and leave, extra seam allowance so you can play a little bit more and really see what it's gonna do out of the real fabric. That's all we have for you today. Hopefully this will at least get you started, give you some ideas, thinking about draping, thinking about where you might want to put a fancy cowl into your designs. I hope you've enjoyed. Please always remember to hit that like button, share with your friends if you'd like, and stay tuned for the next one. If you are loving this, you want to learn more about pattern making, know that we always have our free pattern masterclass, which you can find the link for down below, completely free, kind of shows you my different way of approaching learning pattern making. And if you are all in, you're like, I want to get ready to start. I love the way Trish teaches, which makes me happy. You can get started at Pattern Making Academy. You can find more out about that at learnpatternmaking.com. That is Mimi G's sister school to Sew It Academy, where we focus completely on pattern making, and I am your lead instructor. That's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.